Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I see people are joining and showing up. This is awesome. All right. I'm going to give it a few more moments for people to trickle on in and make sure that we're set up with the streaming services so that people can also watch online. So get comfortable. Grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee or something like that, and we'll get started in just a few moments. Quite a few people joined. So welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm really glad that you're able to join us today for our interactive webinar. Now, the tools that you get today, they will help you to get to know your audience better and also to practice intentionally inclusive science communication. And that will be done through applying principles of empathy and human-centered design. Now, one of the primary tenets of effective communication that the Alda Center focuses on is empathy. And that is why I am very excited to introduce you to our featured speaker for the day, which is Dr. Shawntel Okonkwo. She is a PhD molecular biologist. She's a TEDx speaker and an international scientific consultant who has allowed creativity and empathy to be her guideposts in all of her work across the science space and the science communication landscape. Now, today, she's going to give us some tools, and there will be hands-on interactive exercises that we can take with us into our next communication effort, and she'll guide us step by step through a unique approach to reframe the way that we look at audiences. So I am turning it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Elise. That was a wonderful introduction. So I'm very excited to be here with you all today for the Alda Center's webinar on thinking like a designer for more inclusive science communication that's a bit more intentional. Now, before we jump into the actual presentation itself, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I am currently on. I'm currently on the Ohlone land in Los Angeles, California. This is something that I like to ensure that I do with every single presentation, just so that we can acknowledge those who are the first peoples who inhabit the land of whomever we're actually leveraging the space for to do it, whether it's business or whether it's actually communicating to audiences, as well as being able to leverage the fact that we're using this land for any kind of outcomes. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump into the presentation. Just give me 1 minute, having a little bit of a technical hiccup here. But right before we do that, I want to make sure that the audience here is ready with their mobile phones. Because this is an interactive webinar, we're going to be leveraging our mobile phones so we can be able to get onto the QR code and get onto the website so that you can actually participate in some of the exciting activities we have today. Again, I'm very excited to be jumping into some of why I believe there is a role for human-centric design in science communication, particularly as we think about inclusive science communication. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen once I get a moment to get this all presented up. And while this is coming up, again, I know that this webinar is meant to be interactive, so we do have a Q&A and a chat functionality that allows for people in the audience to actually interact with us. We will be holding questions and answers towards the end of this webinar, just so that we can make sure we get through everything in the amount of time we have allotted today. But again, please bring your curiosity, as well as bring the opportunity for us to actually engage and question how we're actually thinking about inclusive science communication and how intentional we're being in understanding new ways of thinking about science communication. All righty, so 1 moment, please. You know, sometimes when we do these digital presentations, things can often go a little awry when it comes to the technical side of things. But again, I know most of us have probably experienced this being in Zoom rooms and being on Teams and what have you throughout the pandemic. So I'm sure that this isn't new to anybody on the call today.
You can always count on technology to do something strange at the most inopportune moment.
Right. Exactly. But if you just give me one moment, we're going to go ahead and get started here, just moving some things around to make sure that we all have the best experience in being able to go through this particular presentation. All righty, so let me go ahead and get this set up for you all. And again, I think we have the interactive function here. So as we get started with the presentation itself or this particular workshop, would definitely love to get us a little bit warmed up in terms of interacting. So if you're able to jump into the chat or the Q&A section here and maybe making some mentions about where you're actually logging in from. I know that we're live streaming from a number of locations around the US and potentially around the world. So it'd be great to get a little bit of an idea of where you guys are located.
Yes, please do pop into the chat. I would love to see where you all are joining from. Okay, we've got Austin. Whoa, 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 whoa. Oh goodness, I have to keep up with this. Hang on. All right, so we've got Nebraska, Texas, Oklahoma, DC, Colorado, Wisconsin, Illinois, LA. Oh, there's somebody in LA with you. Okay. New York, that's where I'm from. Oh, Canada, okay. MD, you know what? I'm showing my poor geography skills here. I don't actually know. No, is that Maryland? Is MD Maryland? Goodness, I'm terrible with geography.
It is Maryland, yes, that is correct, Elise.
All right. Yeah, we've got someone else from Oklahoma and LA. California, Washington, Wyoming. Oh, this is awesome. South Carolina. Okay. Wow. Michigan, the University of Notre Dame, Newfoundland. Oh, someone else from Canada, British Columbia. Wow. We have someone joining us from Australia. It is 5 a.m. Thank you so much, sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, for waking up early for this. Oh, and Hawaii. Oh, this is amazing. Germany. Okay. Wow.
Incredible. That is incredible. It's really amazing to hear that there's such a wide diversity of participants from truly all over the world. And again, we're very much excited to have an offering for you all today to explore with us how thinking like a designer can foster intentionally inclusive Scicomm. So again, thank you so much, Elise, and the Alda Center again for having this space and hosting us. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so that all of our participants can get in touch with this webinar. All righty, just want to make sure that we're all seeing the same screen here, this very title screen of how thinking like a designer can foster intentionally inclusive Scicomm. Is that correct?
That's what I'm seeing. Is that what you guys are seeing? Yep, we've got thumbs up.
Fantastic, that's great. All righty, so we're gonna go ahead and jump in here. Now, like I mentioned, today we're gonna have a relatively short agenda, but we're gonna try to run through things relatively quickly because thinking about intentionally inclusive Scicomm is actually quite a broad field, and it's something that can definitely not be done in a short amount of time. And there are also many thought leaders existing in the space, publishing and speaking about this topic. So the role today is really to give ourselves a high-level overview of what intentional inclusive Scicomm is, as well as bringing in a new paradigm for how thinking like a designer can foster this sense of intentionality and inclusive Scicomm and understanding audience archetypes. Now, again, we're going to start here with an introduction. We're going to go through an icebreaker. This is going to be a little bit more interactive again, so I can get some more audience participation and get you all warmed up. We'll walk through then the why inclusive Scicomm matters. And again, we're keeping this relatively high level for the purposes of this presentation. We'll then go into how empathy informs inclusion and this new idea of human-centric design, intentionality, and Scicomm. Again, really excited to introduce this idea to this audience because it's something that, from my particular research and experience, hasn't necessarily been articulated before. And again, giving just a high-level understanding of how we can pull from that space in science communication. We'll then go into a really quick activity around empathy mapping for your audiences. Might touch on very quickly some caveats and considerations for us to keep in mind, because again, we want to respect the field of human-centric design, as well as respect the field of Scicomm as we apply these approaches. and then thinking about what are some of the next steps for you. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump in. Now, again, just a quick disclaimer, the views expressed in this workshop are my own and do not reflect any reviews of any employer, contractors, or my clients. There are no conflicts of interest. So really quickly, just about me, you're probably wondering, who is this woman that's talking to us on the screen now? Many of you probably recognize me from my TED Talk on intersectionality in STEM that I gave back in 2019. In this talk, I explored themes of power, privilege, and passage, and how they bring in new barriers and perpetuate barriers for people who exist at the margins of society in participating, in consuming, and also being producers of STEM. Also, one thing that some of our users here on the call today might recognize about me is that I'm actually a molecular biologist. So I earned my PhD at UCLA in the Molecular Biology Institute. And there I did a lot of research in understanding chromatin dynamics and how they impact the genome. But outside of the science itself, a lot of the work that I've done in this science communication space is probably recognized by some of the work I've done with Woke STEM. I've created a YouTube channel as well as a community that's focused on understanding the socially conscious side of science and thinking about how can we create new spaces for inviting, again, those who exist in the margins into STEM. A lot of the work that I've done through that project, as well as my own individual projects, has led me into science communication consulting engagements from everywhere from Denmark, as well as in Tokyo and across the US. Again, and a lot of my other work in science communication does lie in education and coaching as well. So some of the thought leadership as well as my coaching workshops have been placed in other organizations around the United States. And if you visit my website that I have here at the QR code, you can read a little bit more. But again, I don't want to dive too much into who I am. I really would like to establish this conversation, really a conversation, a digital one, to explore what are the relationships between human-centric design and science communication. Now, to get us warmed up to this conversation, I'd like for us to engage in an icebreaker. So if you don't mind taking out your mobile phones and scanning this QR code that's on the screen here, or you can go to menti.com or mentimeter.com and enter this code. All right, so as you can see here on the screen, there's some people joining. We have 7 people joining so far. I think we have quite a lot more people on the call itself, so definitely like to see a little bit more participation. Okay, we have 22 people joining, 24, 25. All right, once we get to, let's say we're gonna get to 40. I'd like to see at least 40 people interact with this icebreaker. I think that'll make it for a really fun one. All righty, so we're gonna go ahead and jump right in. So if you're on your phones, you're likely to be able to see this screen here. And the question is, what does inclusion mean to you? Don't think too hard on it, just give it really quick reaction. Go ahead and enter your responses. So once you enter your response, it should show up on the screen here. Okay, so we're seeing a feeling of belonging, a sense of belonging, not leaving anyone behind, diversity, everyone has a seat, accessibility for all. This is fantastic. I'm seeing so many responses around belonging, seeing other responses around elevating voices, consideration and valuing the various backgrounds of participants is a large one. Again, belonging seems like it's a word that's coming up quite often here, as well as everybody, everywhere, and voices. Now, the reason why I wanted for us to have this as our icebreaker about what inclusion means to you is because I'd like us to now think about the next question. Well, we have a little voting thing here. We're gonna go ahead and skip that. We're gonna go on to the next question, and I'd like you to just take a moment to think about, what does inclusion feel like to you? Note that what it means to you and what it feels like to you may be different. So just take a moment to consider that. Okay. So as you can see here, we're getting a number of responses around feels empowering. It feels clean. It feels warm. It feels forced. Interesting. Feels being listened to, comfortable and warm, acceptance, being at ease and open, comfort, again, not feeling left out, happiness. So a variety of these responses seem to be centered around warmness and comfort and being respected, not being feeling left out, ease. When we think about the responses we had from the audience on what the inclusion means to you and what inclusion feels like to you, do note that there is a pretty large discrepancy there when we consider what our thoughts are around a particular word or experience, or let's say even a particular messaging versus what our feelings are. And in this particular regard, we're focusing on inclusion, but you can take that same paradigm and apply it to when we're thinking about our audiences and how we design science communication messaging or strategies for these audiences. We may come from the paradigm of, okay, what this particular topic may mean to somebody, but what does it actually feel like to them? This is something that I feel that is really strong when we consider how we design inclusive science communication strategies or messages, or even consider, again, the audiences that we're hoping to target. Alrighty, so we'll go ahead and move on in the presentation itself. We're going to skip the voting section. Now, I want us to take a moment to reflect on this image. And as you reflect on this image, I'd like for you to just think about what feelings come up, what thoughts come up as well. What does it represent to you? As you consider some of these notions, I'd like to introduce here this topic of why inclusive science communication matters. Most of us here in this particular webinar can know what it feels like going through COVID-19. We all had a variety of experiences, existing in the pandemic, and some of us might not have existed anymore. And I'm very sorry for your losses if that was you or anybody in your family. Now, the reason why I included this image is because COVID-19 brought about a very nuanced understanding in science communication, and it also brought up this nuanced understanding of how important it is to consider intersectionality in science communication. Again, because when there's dominant narratives or dominant paradigms or ways of thinking and producing knowledge and communicating knowledge that pervade how we actually connect with audiences, we can start to perpetuate this discrepancy or sense of exclusion when it comes to actually connecting with the audiences that may potentially need it the most. Besides that, we also see in the COVID-19 pandemic that there was a very large discrepancy in the science communication messaging as it pertained to disproportionately marginalized audiences, particularly Black and Brown populations in the United States. And when I say Black and Brown, I use it as a very large and wide term. But again, specifically here, when we think about the Black population in the United States and how they're affected by COVID-19, the science communication that was spread around this particular topic started to, again, bring light to the fact that there needs to be a bit more nuance and intentionality for how we actually communicate with a variety of audiences because of this very fact that our experiences can differ, and they do differ. So why does inclusive science communication matter? Again, the purpose of this presentation isn't meant to be an overview of why this matters, because this is a rapidly emerging field. And one of the reasons why I wanted to just really take a quick pause here in the presentation was to introduce this really fantastic paper that was published by Canfield and Menezes. I apologize if I mispronounce your names. Effectively, they produced the State of Inclusive Science Communication, which is a landscape study that looked at really what are some of the current tactics in thinking about science communication and bringing in this framing of intersectionality, equity, and inclusion when we think about how we communicate science to audiences that are traditionally marginalized or left out. Why particularly inclusive science communication matters, again, pulling from this paramount landscape study, is, again, intentionality, being able to be considerate about our audiences and how they define science and how they even consume knowledge is very important, because it then defines how we particularly design our science communication strategies or even connect with our audiences. Reflexivity as another component of this particular landscape study, looking at inclusive science communication as something that, again, we want for practitioners and those on the other side to keep in mind in terms of reflecting on our own biases, reflecting on our own positionality as we think about our audiences that we're trying to connect to. when this isn't necessarily brought into the equation of designing science communication strategies, we can again start to perpetuate those biases that tend to create the spaces of exclusion that has so pervaded the space of science communication for so long. So reflexivity and being able to take a step back, examine ourselves, examine our biases, our positionality, our sense of power, or even our systemic and societal positions of power, and how they again impact how we're designing our science communication, or even how we're connecting or defining audiences. And lastly, reciprocity, excuse me. And reciprocity here is really focusing on being able to understand the equal and unequal partnerships that exist in the space, as well as thinking about how these various ways of producing consuming knowledge is something that needs to be considered when designing inclusive science communication. Again, this is just a very high level overview. I definitely encourage you all to visit this paper, as well as other papers that are emerging in the field. But again, the focus for us here in this presentation today is on the intentionality. As I've been sitting and thinking about intentionality in inclusive science communication, it really struck a chord with me, because when we think about how to empathize with our audiences, how to connect with our audiences, right? I think most science communicators typically tend to focus on knowing your audience, asking a few clarifying questions to understand the state of context, how much they know about a particular topic, and they move forward from there. That used to be okay when we weren't as privy to the fact that different audience members have different experiences. So being a bit more intentional at that step of knowing your audience is where I would like for us to focus today. And this is where we're starting to bring in these new themes of how principles from human-centric design processes can actually inform how we're being intentional with connecting with our audiences, as well as defining our audiences. Now, when we think about empathy, right? I know when we had our icebreaker, people were having senses of ease and comfort, sense of belonging, respect. Empathy is a really important aspect when we think about inclusion, right? Empathy is really focused on understanding and respecting the lived experiences of others as truths to enable a sense of belonging. Rather than censoring our own and using that as a predominant narrative of what can be true or what is not true, we're respecting the lived experiences of others, and we're actually leveraging that information to connect with them further, right? When we respect the fact that people's experiences are their own truths, and we respect and honor that and design that into science communication, it can actually help us connect with our audiences much better. The reason why I bring up empathy more specifically here is because in being intentional, right, in terms of understanding who your audience is, especially when we consider audiences that are typically marginalized, when you want to be intentional in connecting with these audiences, it's very important to understand their lived experiences. Being able to actually deeply empathize and actively listen to these narratives, to these experiences, and take them not only as just anecdotes, simple anecdotes. No, these are people's actual lived experiences, and they actually inform the way they connect with science, the way they engage with science. When we think about history and how, and I don't want to go too deep into this because of time, but when we think about the historical disparities that have existed with regards to Black people in the United States and STEM and medicine, we think about Henrietta Lacks and those narratives and those experiences that existed. Those are things that actually impact the way that some people actually consider how they receive particular science communication messaging. So again, being able to take a step back and understanding that active listening and empathizing with your audience is very important, to be able to recognize that these people's experiences are truths and should be respected as we design new science communication or redesign other science communication strategies. And the reason why this is important, because again, when we respect the lived experiences and the lived narratives of people who exist at the margins as truths, it then begins to foster a sense of inclusion and belonging, which then can enable more audience reception. Now, before I jump into human-centric design in Scicomm, and I know most of us seeing this image here, some of us in the call might be designers ourselves, Some of us might be purely science communicators, and some of us might just be very curious people. So before I actually jump into this image, you might want to just stare at it for a little bit and let it digest. I want to, again, introduce and articulate this concept of audience monoliths. This is going back to the intentionality that was brought up in the landscape study on inclusive science communication. When we think about intentionality in understanding who our audiences are, sometimes, and things that have happened in the past, I know most of us have some personal experiences as well as professional experiences. When we're trying to define an audience, it can be very easy to fall into the space of creating caricatures or creating monoliths, right? And this might be unintentional. This might be just due to purely ignorance, not really understanding how to connect with the audience. So just moving off of the biases and the things that you do know, what you have been exposed to. This also, creating audience monoliths might be a result of actually not really taking the time or the care or the resources to actually understand your audience. The intentionality on taking a step further beyond the high level surface way of understanding who your audience is one thing I'd like for us to focus on today. And I'm pulling from the human-centric design process. In this process, and again, by no means am I specifically a designer myself. However, my experiences in the human-centric design space around user experience research has enabled me to consider the ways that we can pull from the research phase of users' experiences and how we can apply that same paradigm to researching our audiences to be able to understand a bit more about their needs, their behaviors, their motivations, their pains and gains, what they're thinking about, and what actually creates their world. So again, at a very high level here, human-centric design is really a paradigm and really an area of doing and thinking and designing for how we center the human. It's focused on understanding, and I use the word user here because typically people tend to see human-centric design and product development and thinking about users and customers. However, at the research phase, we're really focused on understanding, again, the people, their needs that they have, and their problems. And doing so with qualitative research methods as well as ethnographic research methods, we can actually leverage the narratives, the spoken narratives of our users, or in this case, of our audience, as real data to enable us to think a little bit deeper about who our audience is and break down any potential monoliths that we might be creating based off of our own stereotypes or our biases. So again, I'm not going into detail here specifically around the full process or some of the other design principles and philosophies in human-centric design because there are many. It is a very, very well-respected and established field. But again, really want to focus on pulling on this side of the human-centric design high-level process, thinking about centering the human and understanding their motivations, needs, benefits, as well as pains and gains so that we can start to design audiences and target our audiences in ways that are a little bit more respectful for their lived experience and tailor our messaging based off of their lived experience so that the messages that we do create can actually be received properly. Now, as I mentioned before, research-driven human-centric design principles can help intentionally center the lived experiences and unique motivations of your target audience. The reason, again, why this is very important for intentionally inclusive science communication is because the prevailing methods of communicating science or even engaging with audiences has really been centered around this way of being a little high level and being focusing a bit more on the erasure of the unique intersectionality of some of the audiences that we're trying to connect with. If you're thinking about audiences that might be, let's say we're focusing on a particular audience that is an aging population and they are from a particular area in the global South, one may be able to come up, make some assumptions, right, about what their competence about the science is and really just focus on that knowledge piece of the science communication strategy. However, when we don't take a step back and consider the experiences of the people that we're trying to connect with and understand the narratives, what they might have been hearing, right? Understanding what are some of the things that they might have gone through, really leveraging their specific narratives as data, it's very easy to make assumptions that are so far off that they don't even connect with the audience in any way, shape, or form, and lead to a lack of audience engagement. Now, again, leveraging some principles from human-centric design is a great way for us to start to consider a new way of breaking down these audience monoliths by centering the user, or in this case, our audience, specifically, and breaking down any assumptions that we might have had, and being intentional in doing so by leveraging research methodologies to understand our audience before we create our messaging. Now, I'm just going to take a really quick pause in case there are any pressing questions that are coming out in the audience. I know we have some time left at the very end to go into this in detail, but I would like to just take a moment here if there's any questions that we'd like to address specifically before we move on. I know this is a lot of content to digest.
Okay, so we had a couple of people who said that the code wasn't working for them. Would you all, if you're still here, mind just popping into the chat whether you were able to get it to work after all? Because there's going to be more use of Mentimeter in a few minutes. No. Oh, okay. That is unfortunate. We're okay. Good to know. Good to know. Okay, so a few people weren't able to get it to work. Oh no, your phone died.
Oh, interesting.
Okay.
So they're not able to get the Mentimeter to work. Is there any error message that's coming up? Is it coming up blank? Just a little bit more description there can help us out.
All right. So, people do not need to create an account. Usually I find that the QR code, oh, it says the code is not valid. That's interesting. Code could not be found. Please try again. Okay, so you know what? I am wondering if because we already had started running the actual, like running the questions, if maybe the code stopped working at that point.
Interesting.
Try the QR code, the Menti website, and Mentimeter, and the same message on all of them. Code is not valid. Interesting. Okay, so you know what? When we do try again with the code, I think we should take a few minutes before jumping into it just to make sure that people are actually able to get in.
Okay.
All right, we're gonna, and hopefully it works. Okay, thank you guys very much for that. Okay, yes. Of course, technology always, always. Okay. And then of course, like Dr. O said, does anyone have any pressing questions? Not Mentimeter related? Okay, we've got the Q&A open. All right, so Kevin wants to know, says, I can imagine that we could have multiple audiences to understand, empathize with, and communicate with. How do we manage the volume of work this could create and the confusion among the scientific communicators?
That's a very valid question, Kevin. And thank you for producing that, because I'm sure probably the question that others have been thinking about as well. This is, again, where intentionality, from my personal opinion, comes in, because when you're intentional, you're not really thinking about volume, right? It's more so thinking about quality rather than quantity. So again, I do empathize with the fact that dealing with a large number of audience types can be very difficult. But when you take the time and the resources to invest in taking a step back and really understanding your audience types, you might want to maybe consider focusing on a few first rather than all. Again, it might also take a moment for you or your team to consider, what is your actual end goal and your end strategy here? Are you trying to reach as many people as possible? Because then that would have some implications on how you're actually defining your audience, right? You're trying to reach as many people as possible, you might be doing quite a few generalizations here. But if you're trying to reach very specific populations and you'd like to be very inclusive, intentional, and respectful in doing so, again, building in and investing that time, effort, and resource to be able to understanding those specific audiences can go a very long way because, again, when we think about the intentionality and the investment that goes into connecting with audiences better, you have better engagement over time, as opposed to, throwing stuff at a wall and hope it sticks and see who it sticks with. So it's a complex one, but at a very high level, that's the way that I would approach that. And I hope that helps.
Thank you for that. And we have another question, which let me see if I can I move this out of the way? I can. Okay. Someone who is anonymous says, could you give an example of a piece of science communication that is tailored to the lived experiences of a target audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a question that's probably going to take some time to really reflect on, because when we think about targeting audiences, you really want to take a step back and think about, again, why do we want to target a particular audience? I think that's a big question that we want to consider when we're thinking about being specific in our inclusive science communication. One example that might come to mind is, again, thinking about how some particular, I don't want to say necessarily the names of these companies, but some companies, again, specifically in the COVID-19 pandemic, were focusing on leveraging representation visually of darker skin, more melanated Black people in their messaging when they're talking about the benefits of taking the vaccine and why it helps, right? There were other messaging that came out during the pandemic that was focused, again, for these populations that tend to be marginalized, more specifically in the space of medicine and science communication. And they were pretty direct and focused on saying things like the vaccine is going to help you, it's not going to hurt you, you need to take it, those kinds of messaging. So if you'd like for me to kind of provide some very specific examples, you can connect with me offline via email, and then we can go into detail there and I can give you some of those citations if that's helpful.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Kevin had a follow-up, but I want to make sure that we are able to move through with the actual hands-on portion of this. So we'll come back at the end of it to the rest of the Q&As. All right.
That sounds fantastic. Thanks everyone for your questions so far. Again, I appreciate you for staying curious and being engaged. So back to the presentation itself. So far we've talked about human-centric design at a very, very high level. Again, this is a very large field. And we talked about the research aspect and the user centricity aspect and how that can inform better understanding of our audiences. We also touched on this idea of audience monoliths, specifically when we think about marginalized populations that typically haven't been served when we think about science communication. Hence why this space of inclusive science communication has become an rapidly emerging field. At this point in the presentation, I'd like to introduce this particular tool called empathy mapping. Now, empathy mapping is a tool that comes, again, from some of the human-centric design world that's focused on understanding user needs. So as you can see here on the slide at the very center, typically you'll have a specific target user that's in mind, and then around this particular user is where you build the universe of what they think and feel, what they see, what they say and do, what they hear, and their pains and gains. Again, this is a vast oversimplification of how this exercise actually works. Again, this is more so focused on doing the research first, getting that feedback directly from the user themselves, sitting down and having these ethnographic interviews, these user interviews, so that you can really hear from them themselves and not bias what they're telling you, so that you can actually leverage that as true empirical data to then build into this empathy map. So again, I wanted to just clarify that this is a very high level oversimplification of the entire process. However, for the purposes of this particular presentation, it is something that could be of high value when we think about science communication, specifically in the space of connecting with audiences. If one is getting trouble, finding some struggle in connecting with their audiences, specifically that are living at the margins in a particular axis of intersectionality, it might be worthwhile to, again, intentionally take that step further and dive into what do they think and feel? What do they see? What do they say and do? What do they hear? Their pains and gains. And doing this with the actual target audience that you have in mind first, as opposed to just throwing out a bunch of your assumptions, and then just seeing where things go from there. So again, for the purposes of the presentation, this is not going to be a full exercise. What we're planning to do today is to actually walk through a very, very high level, very quickly, just a few questions, filling out few particular spaces of this empathy map, just so that we can get used to this idea, this exercise of actually doing the work. Again, the caveat here is that in order to fill out an empathy map, you would need to do the research and actually sit down or stay with the actual target user that you have in mind and pull their narratives and experiences into this so that they, one, can be validated. If you'd like to maybe take a start for what we're going to do today, take a stab to kind of do a free version of your empathy map so that you can use that to validate your assumptions when you're sitting down or you're speaking with the target audience that you have in mind. That could actually be a great place to start as well if you want to be very targeted in the kind of science communication that you have. And again, this is meant to be a proactive listening-based exercise when you do this in the field, as opposed to something that's done reactively after the fact. But again, by researching, validating, and iterating, you can make this a very reflexive and a very flexible based process so that you can not only learn about your audience one time, you can continue to understand how dynamics may shift in a specific audience that you're focused on. Again, the goal here is to break down these audience monoliths so we can have a better understanding of who they are and how we can connect with them for more targeted and tailored science communication in the future. Now, for this exercise, we're going to be leveraging Mentimeter once again, and I'll give you all some time to be able to connect to the actual interface. Now, we're going to walk through, again, very, very high level, and I'm throwing all kinds of caveats out here because doing these exercises, again, is based on doing that research with the users, with the audiences that you'd like to target specifically. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to just take a step back and we're going to leverage some of our assumptions, and hopefully we'll try to validate. So in this particular use case, we have Amara. Amara is a 35-year-old Black woman who works as a community liaison for a large national nonprofit organization. She works with helping connect aging populations in South Los Angeles to health resources, particularly COVID-19 vaccines. And we're doing this a little retrospectively. She's struggling to get her stakeholders to believe the vaccine does not disproportionately affect Black populations. I'm confident that some of us here in the call can understand what this might feel like and what this might mean. Again, note the differences between the two. Now, you're going to step into the shoes of a science communicator that may work in some other agency, that might work for a university. You might just be a scientist, a citizen scientist. Your goal is to communicate the benefits of the vaccine to help her stakeholders, which are these aging populations in South Los Angeles who are struggling to really believe that the vaccine isn't disproportionately affecting Black populations. So hopefully that gave everyone a moment to get connected to the Mentimeter. And what we'll then do moving forward, so far we have 11 people who thumbs up this, which is great. It's nice to see that interactive buy-in. So as you all get connected here, what we're going to be doing for this exercise in the last 5 to 7 minutes of this particular presentation is we're going to walk through just a few segments of what does Amara see and what does she hear. We'll then fill in some of these segments. We're not going to do it all because we don't have a lot of time, and this is meant to be a very thorough and longer process. We're going to fill it in onto our own interactive Jamboard, which is typically how you'd like to do these, kind of putting stickies up so that we can see how this might look like live. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and move into this next section. Again, keeping in mind the narrative of Amara and her goals as well as your goals.
I just want to make sure that people are actually getting into the Mentimeter. Do you see people joining?
Let me check that with that slide. All righty. I am seeing, no, not seeing anybody joining actually. Oh, one person has joined and responded. Okay. So I'm not sure if there are any issues in joining the Mentimeter, please do make a comment here. I am seeing that there's a few people who are responding already. So it seems like there's some functionality happening.
And some people are still getting the same error, unfortunately. I'm going to try it on my end as well. Hang on.
Thanks, sorry about that. Now, as we have that being troubleshoot, again, the purpose of this particular exercise is to focus on what Amara sees, right? What do you feel that she is seeing? Again, more specifically, you'd want to be doing the research with Amara and really be articulating some of these questions so that you're getting that specific information from her, then summarizing into the empathy map so that you can now test your assumptions and validate whether they're true or not, as well as pull in her actual lived experiences so that you can design your science communication a bit more specifically. Some things you might want to think about in terms of like, what does Amara see are, what does she see in her marketplace? What does she see in her immediate environment? What does she see others saying and doing? What is she watching and what is she reading? Again, I want you to kind of ponder on some of these questions because the purpose of this is to dive a bit deeper into her pains, gains, motivations, and her needs so that we can tailor our messaging, not to be high level and just focus on that knowledge base, that non-participatory mode of science communication, where we're just communicating the facts and that's it, but pulling in some of the reasons why she may be resistant to a particular message. So some of the things I think we should include on our empathy map with regards to what do they see based off of the responses we're getting from our audience here is we're seeing fear and doubt. That's coming up quite often. That's really interesting one. Distrust and fear. Anxiety is another one that's coming up pretty often. Feeling uncomfortable, reluctance. Now there's various television shows. That's an interesting one, that what she sees. Uncertainty, hesitation, confusion and misinformation.
Let me just interrupt really quickly to say, I'm not having the code work for me. So for those of you where it's not working for you, pop your answers into the chat and we'll pull from the chat as well. That way you can actually be participating. Okay.
Thanks for that. And again, we apologize for the technical hiccups, but hopefully you're still feeling some value being derived from watching and participating in this exercise or even pondering. Now, before we move on, I just want to read out a few more of these and really highlight the fact that people are diving a bit more deeper and getting very specific, being as detailed and as specific as possible when you're doing this research with your particular audience in mind is the goal here, because you want high quality data and not, very high level data. So examples of people needing access to care, but not feeling confident in the care as it relates to their needs. That's a great one because it's very specific. And it's something that she probably is actually seeing day to day in her particular profession. Being an at-risk, another thing she might be seeing more specifically, an at-risk population who she wants to help. She probably is also uncertain for how best to reach that group. Negative politics, resistance, repeating gossip for social media. So these are fantastic. And again, I thank you all for participating in pulling this in. Hopefully you're starting to feel that sense of what it means to actually go from the space of making an assumption about Amara, thinking that, this is, we're just going to give her the facts. We're just going to be straightforward with it and not really considering maybe the ways that she consumes knowledge, the way that she might produce knowledge, how she actually makes decisions, what influences her behaviors, what influences some of the things that she does more specifically, and how she actually connects with her stakeholders. Leveraging that data is one way that we can start to break down who our audience is, and again, tailor our science communication messaging based off of the user centricity, their needs, their behaviors, the things that they need. So we have a few of these put down here. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next one. And normally, again, this is super duper high level because it's a very short webinar. Typically, when you do the research, when you summarize and place it onto an empathy map, you typically as a team will start to kind of vote and discuss, and there's just a lot of rigorous research methodology that goes into actually establishing what we feel about this particular user and what we're hearing from them. So we're going to move on to the second one now. Now, again, in keeping in mind Amara's particular use case and her needs, what does Amara hear? What is she hearing others say? What is she hearing from her friends? What might she be hearing from colleagues, and what might she be hearing secondhand? It might be helpful here to, again, put yourself in the shoes of Amara, again, from the empathy perspective and respecting her lived experiences as truths. When we put ourselves into the shoes of Amara, it might help us to think a little bit more critically about what she might be hearing. And again, to just raise a caveat, this is very high level. The purpose, the real way of doing this is to get in front of your users and gain their voices, gain their experiences and their actual narratives as ways to consider what she's actually hearing and how we can design our empathy map to focus specifically on her and not as her as a monolith. So I'll just read out a few here before we move on. So we're seeing firsthand experiences from friends and family and from those in the community that she's working with. There's misinformation. People are ignorant for not accepting science. She might be hearing clients repeating misinformation that they believe or asking questions about what they don't understand. A quote here is really great. I think that's another one that could be really helpful when you actually research with your audiences prior to designing your communication. Why should we trust blank medical institution? They betrayed us before, right? So again, I won't go into too much detail here, and I really am so happy to see that people are really diving in and interacting and putting themselves in the shoes of Amara. The goal here is to be as detailed as possible for what we're hearing from Amara, getting her experiences, her narratives, so that we can leverage that to tailor the science communication accordingly. And so what I'd like to do really quickly, I know we're just short on time, and apologize if some of us have to jump right at the top of the hour. But what I'd like for us to do is just really focus. I'm going to basically bring another screen out here and be as transparent as possible. So effectively, what we've been doing here and building out this empathy map for Amara is pulling out what we see, or what does Amara see, and pulling out some of the responses here onto this map. So you can kind of think about this as like maybe pulling stickies onto a board, right? And then also pulling that for what does she hear. We can continue doing this exercise for some of the other aspects of Amara's particular experience. And when we fill this out, you're then able to start to get a better picture of her experience so that you can design your science communication to be more specific to her needs, as well as something that can be responsive for what we'd like our goal to be in our science communication. So again, very high level way of thinking about applying this methodology to designing and deconstructing audience monoliths for inclusive science communication. But hopefully this helps to create a way for us to consider the ways in which that leveraging principles from empathy mapping, specifically in human-centric design, are great ways for thinking about how we can actually start to deconstruct audience monoliths and be able to really understand a way for the way that we can actually connect with our full audiences in a way that's not necessarily perpetuating those ways in which we typically exclude other audiences, but also it actually starts to invite more participation from the audiences that we're really trying to connect with. Just one moment while I get the presentation right back up here for you all. Any other questions before we wrap up the end of this presentation? Anything coming out in the chat so far?
Yes, actually. So Heather asks, so Amara is our research mediator. We're not talking to her constituents as the researchers?
Yes, that's correct. So Amara would be the person that you're communicating. She's our basically she's our end user in this particular regard, because she's connecting with her stakeholders. So we're trying, sometimes as science communicators, we actually are helping to equip other people with communicating science. So we kind of function as a liaison in some way so that we can help them be deliverer of the messages or connect with their audience so that they can receive the science communication that actually best fit for the needs of their end users. Hopefully that helps to clarify that point.
Okay, thank you. And then going back to the earlier question from Kevin when Kevin was speaking about having multiple audiences to empathize with and communicate with. Your response was, talking about the quality and really narrowing down those audiences. So Kevin says quality, yes, but time, resources, energy are finite. When the goal is reaching as many as possible, or even just a wide range, we need to prioritize somehow. How do we do that and stay true to the idea of understanding the lived experience and not just make broad assumptions?
Absolutely. That's such a poignant point, Kevin, that you brought up. And I really appreciate that you've been critically engaged in this presentation so far. One of the things that I can offer to this particular question, and we can communicate further offline just to be respectful of time. We are a little bit over time now. One of the things I can quickly offer here is that, again, if you're going back to the goal and the strategy, if your high level goal is to connect to as many audiences as possible, you may want to reconfigure your strategy to be a bit more phased as opposed to doing like one broad paint stroke in terms of the cadence and how you'd like to communicate. If you'd like to kind of, again, focusing again on the fact that, yes, you'd like to prioritize, and yes, time and resources are finite, but what is the long-term goal and strategy? What would you like for your audience to do? What is the call to action here? Then work backward and thinking about, okay, if I want to strategize and create a messaging strategy that's a bit more focused on one particular audience type or the audience type that probably will have the most immediate impact, that might be a way that you can start to kind of break down that problem or that challenge in complex messaging cadences, as well as thinking about how you can actually allocate resources. And that's one of the ways I can think about it. But again, we can discuss a little bit more offline if you'd like. I do have the QR code up here if you guys would like to get more in contact with me to discuss some of the aspects that we talked about in this presentation at a very, very high level, or to connect with me further if you'd like to work with me further on this particular topic or others as well. With that being said, I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. This was such a labor of love. A huge thank you to the Alda Center for providing this space and opportunity and working with me to actually deliver this message to this large audience. I firmly do believe in intersectionality in STEM, as you can see some of the work that I've done in the past, as well as STEM inclusion and this growing space of inclusive science communication and how it really can impact multiple aspects of society and start to create senses of belonging and inclusion in the spaces that do require it. So again, I appreciate everyone's participation on the call today. Hopefully you left with a new way of thinking about empathy mapping, a new way of connecting and deconstructing audience monoliths. Again, if you'd like to explore further or discuss further, please do reach out to me. And also a huge shout out to the design field, specifically the human-centric design field. There's a lot of great research and a lot of great methodologies that come out of that space. And I do feel that thinking about science communication from a paradigm of design and experience can be a fantastic way to best connect with our audiences. So with that being said, thank you again. Please use the QR code if you'd like to get in touch with me further for any speaking, workshops, or consulting. And thank you, Elise, for everything that you've provided in supporting this particular effort. If there's anything you'd like to add, please do go ahead.
Well, I just want to thank you so very much for having helped to facilitate this and actually share this great information with our audience. And I want to thank everybody who actually came and joined and watched and participated. I'm so glad that you all, imagine getting up at 5 a.m. to actually join this call. I really appreciate it. I hope that you all got something useful out of it. I know that I did. And a quick question, do you have an empathy map template that you can recommend for the viewers? Is that a thing?
That's so one, I'll give you two answers. So there are quite a few templates that exist online, very basic templates. But again, I do want to, the second answer is I want to urge and emphasize that this human-centric design field is a very rigorous, very well-respected, and very sophisticated field in terms of qualitative research. So depending on how you design your research, when you speak with these users or speak with these audience types specifically, you might want to tailor your empathy map a little bit differently. And in that case, I would highly recommend reaching out to a user experience researcher, a contractor, or a consultant in that space to kind of help you with that in particular. Otherwise, there are some templates that do exist online if you'd like to kind of do it yourself first and see if you can try to figure it out with certain audiences. But again, just understand that doing it the right way with the professionals is the best way to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining. Don't forget, if you have any further questions, you can scan the QR code that's on the screen right now, and it'll get you in touch with Dr. O. And thank you so much. Hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day, night, wherever it is that you are, wherever you're joining from. And stay well and stay warm or cool if you're on the other side of the world, where I think it's getting warm now. All right. Thank you all so much. And thank you very much, Dr. O.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.